At the reading of the will, my stepmom shouted, "I will contest this. I will contest this." Patricia's shrill voice cut through the mahogany-paneled conference room like nails on a chalkboard. Her perfectly manicured fingers clutched the edge of the polished table so hard her knuckles went white, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw her carefully constructed mask of grief slip completely. Mr. Henderson, Dad's longtime attorney, barely flinched. At 72, he'd probably seen every possible reaction to will readings. He simply adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and continued in his measured tone. As I was saying, the estate of Robert James Mitchell, valued at approximately $2.3 million, including the family home on Maple Grove Lane, the lake house in Tahoe, and all investment accounts, is to be left in its entirety to his son, David Mitchell. That would be me. 28 years old, sitting in a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent, trying to process that my father, who I'd barely spoken to in the past year thanks to Patricia's machinations, had somehow found a way to make things right. "This is impossible," Patricia hissed, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper I knew all too well. "Bobby changed his will 8 months ago. I was there. I witnessed it." She turned those ice-blue eyes on me, the same ones that had fooled my father into thinking she was a grieving widow when they met at Mom's cancer support group. Never mind that Patricia had never actually had cancer, just a benign scare that she milked for maximum sympathy. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand your confusion. Your husband did indeed execute a revised will on March 15th of this year, leaving the bulk of his estate to you. However, he contacted my office again on October 2nd, just 6 weeks before his passing, requesting that we restore his original will from 2019. The date hit me like a freight train. October 2nd was the day after Patricia had thrown her little dinner party, the one where she'd invited all of Dad's friends and spent the evening painting me as an ungrateful son who only called when I needed money. I'd left that night thinking I'd lost my father forever. That's legally impossible, Patricia snapped, but I caught the slight tremor in her voice. He was on morphine by then. The cancer had spread to his brain. He wasn't competent to make legal decisions. Actually, Mr. Henderson said, opening a thick file folder, your husband was quite insistent about establishing his mental competency. We have documentation from Dr. Sarah Chen, his oncologist, confirming that while Mr. Mitchell was indeed on pain medication, he remained lucid and capable of making informed decisions until approximately 2 weeks before his death. I watched Patricia's face cycle through confusion, rage, and something that might have been panic. For 3 years, she'd systematically worked to isolate Dad from me, poisoning every conversation with little comments about how busy I was, how I never called, how I was just waiting for him to die so I could inherit his money. The irony wasn't lost on me, she was describing herself. "There has to be some mistake," she said, but her voice had lost its commanding edge. Mr. Henderson's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth. "No mistake, Mrs. Mitchell. Would you like me to continue with the reading?" Patricia's face had gone from flushed to pale in the span of 30 seconds. She released her death grip on the table and leaned back in her chair, but I could see the wheels turning behind those calculating eyes. This was the woman who had convinced my grieving father that she understood his pain, who had moved into our family home just 4 months after Mom's funeral, who had slowly but methodically rewritten the narrative of our family. "Continue," she said quietly, though I recognized that tone. It was the same one she used right before launching into one of her carefully orchestrated guilt trips. Mr. Henderson nodded and lifted another document from his folder. In addition to the main bequest, Mr. Mitchell left specific instructions regarding certain personal items and a letter to be delivered to his son. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's familiar scrawl. My throat tightened. It was the first time I'd seen his handwriting since the birthday card he'd sent me in March, back when Patricia still allowed him to maintain the pretense of our relationship. "What about the prenup?" Patricia's voice had regained some of its edge. "Bobby and I signed a prenuptial agreement that specifically outlined what would happen to his assets." "Yes," Mr. Henderson said, consulting his notes. "The prenuptial agreement you signed on June 15, 2021, does indeed outline asset distribution. However, it specifically states that Mr. Mitchell's pre-existing assets, those acquired before your marriage, would be distributed according to his will. The prenup covers assets acquired during the marriage, which amounts to approximately $47,000 in joint savings and your personal vehicle, which your husband purchased for you." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Patricia had been so focused on manipulating Dad into changing his will that she'd apparently never bothered to read the fine print of her own prenup. Typical Patricia, always assuming she was the smartest person in the room. "That can't be right," she snapped. "The house on Maple Grove, I've been living there for 3 years. I've made improvements, The house was purchased by Mr. Mitchell in 1987, 15 years before he met you," Mr. Henderson interrupted gently. "As were the lake house, purchased in 1995, and the majority of his investment portfolio, established in the early 1990s. I watched Patricia do the math in her head, watched the exact moment she realized that her 3-year campaign of emotional manipulation had netted her less than $50,000 and a used Mercedes. The same Mercedes she convinced Dad to buy her last Christmas, claiming her old Honda was embarrassing for a man of his standing. "There's something else," Mr. Henderson continued, and I saw Patricia's shoulders tense. "Mr. Mitchell also left instructions that Mrs. Patricia Mitchell has 30 days from the reading of this will to vacate the family home on Maple Grove Lane. He's arranged for a transition payment of $10,000 to assist with relocation costs." Patricia shot to her feet so fast her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. $10,000. I gave up 3 years of my life taking care of that man. I nursed him through cancer treatments, I managed his medications, You hired a nurse, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the conference room. "Mrs. Rodriguez did all the actual caregiving. You were too busy redecorating Mom's garden to be bothered with pill schedules." Her head snapped toward me, and for just a moment, I saw pure hatred flash across her features before she caught herself. But it was too late. Mr. Henderson had seen it too. "Don't you dare," Patricia's voice turned venomous, dropping the grieving widow act entirely. "Don't you dare sit there and act like you cared about your father. Where were you during his chemotherapy appointments? Where were you when he was throwing up for hours after treatment? I was the one holding his head over the toilet while you were off playing your little video games." The accusation stung because there was just enough truth in it to hurt. I hadn't been there for most of Dad's treatment, but not because I didn't want to be. Every time I tried to visit, Patricia had somehow made sure I felt unwelcome. Doctor's appointments that got rescheduled after I'd already taken time off work. Treatment sessions where she'd whisper to Dad about how tired he looked, how he needed rest, how visits from difficult family members might set back his recovery. I tried to be there, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But every time I called, you said he was sleeping. Every time I came by, you said it wasn't a good time. Because it wasn't, she snapped. Your father was dying, David. He didn't need the stress of dealing with your guilt and your awkward hovering. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should focus on the remaining details of the will. But Patricia wasn't done. She turned back to me, and I could see her shifting tactics, reaching into her arsenal of manipulation techniques. Her voice softened, taking on that wounded tone that had worked so well on Dad. You know what breaks my heart? Bobby spent his last months worrying about you. Worrying that he'd failed as a father, that he'd somehow driven you away. He loved you so much, David, but he was convinced you resented him. The words hit their target. I felt the familiar stab of guilt that Patricia had weaponized so effectively over the years. But something was different this time. Maybe it was sitting in this conference room, hearing Dad's final wishes read aloud. Maybe it was the fact that he'd found a way to undo her influence, even from beyond the grave. If he was so worried about our relationship, I said slowly, why didn't he ever call me directly? Why did every conversation have to go through you? Patricia's eyes flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. He did call you. You never answered. I checked my phone records going back 6 months, I said, the words coming out more confidently than I felt. Dad's number appears exactly twice. Once in August when I called him for his birthday, and once in September when I called to check on his test results. Both outgoing calls from my phone to his. It was a bluff, but not entirely. I had checked my phone records, though not as thoroughly as I was implying. But Patricia's reaction told me everything I needed to know. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she looked away for just a moment. Mr. Henderson was watching our exchange with the kind of professional interest that told me this wasn't his first family drama. He consulted his folder again. Mr. Mitchell did leave some additional instructions. David, your father wanted me to tell you that he understood why you stopped visiting. His exact words were, tell my son I figured out what was really happening, and I'm sorry it took me so long. The words hit me like a physical blow. Dad had known. Somehow, in those final weeks, he'd seen through Patricia's manipulation. Patricia's carefully constructed composure cracked a little more. That's impossible. Bobby was grateful for everything I did. He told me every day how much he appreciated having me there. I'm sure he did, Mr. Henderson said mildly. However, he also left very specific instructions about his final wishes. Which brings me to another matter. He pulled out yet another document. Mrs. Mitchell, your husband also requested that I inform you that certain recordings have been preserved as part of his personal effects. The word recordings hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. I watched Patricia's face go through a fascinating transformation, confusion melting into understanding, understanding crystallizing into something that looked suspiciously like terror. What recordings? Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but I caught the edge of panic underneath. Mr. Henderson consulted his notes with the methodical precision of a man who'd been practicing law since before I was born. According to Mr. Mitchell's instructions, he began documenting certain conversations and interactions in September of this year. Apparently, he'd grown concerned about discrepancies between what he was being told and what he was observing firsthand. September. That was right around the time Dad had started looking tired in a way that went beyond the cancer treatments. I'd assumed it was the disease progressing, but now I wondered if it had been something else entirely. The exhaustion that comes from realizing you've been living with a stranger. Bobby was on pain medication, Patricia said quickly, that calculated tone creeping back into her voice. He was paranoid, confused. The morphine can cause hallucinations, delusions. Actually, Mr. Henderson interrupted, Dr. Chen's medical records indicate that Mr. Mitchell wasn't prescribed morphine until his final 2 weeks. In September and October, he was on a much lighter pain management regimen that doesn't typically cause cognitive impairment. He flipped through his folder. Tramadol and ibuprofen, primarily. I found myself leaning forward in my chair. Dad had been sharper than Patricia realized. The thought filled me with an odd mixture of pride and grief, pride that he'd seen through her act, grief that he'd had to spend his final months conducting surveillance in his own home. I don't understand what you're implying, Patricia said, but her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her purse. If Bobby had concerns about something, he would have discussed them with me directly. We told each other everything. Did you? Mr. Henderson asked mildly. Tell each other everything. The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples of implication spreading outward. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, but for once, she seemed to be at a loss for words. I thought about the phone calls I tried to make to Dad over the past year, the ones where Patricia would answer and explain that he was sleeping, or in treatment, or having a difficult day. I thought about the birthday party she'd thrown for him in June, the one where I'd been conspicuously not invited until the last minute, then made to feel like an intruder when I showed up with the vintage baseball cards I'd found, the ones from his favorite team that he'd collected as a kid. Where are these recordings now? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. They're being held in our office safe, Mr. Henderson replied. Your father left specific instructions that they should be made available to you, and only you, along with his other personal effects. Patricia's chair creaked as she shifted her weight, and when I glanced at her, I saw something I'd never seen before, genuine fear. Not the performative distress she displayed when Dad received his diagnosis, not the calculated vulnerability she'd used to manipulate him into buying her things. This was raw, animal panic. How many recordings are there? She asked, and I had to give her credit, she was trying to keep her voice level. Mr. Henderson consulted his notes again. 14 separate files, according to the inventory your husband provided. They span from September 8th through October 28th. He looked up at Patricia over his glasses. The final recording was made just 4 days before he passed. October 28th. I remembered that date because it was the day I tried to visit Dad one last time, the day Patricia had met me at the door with red-rimmed eyes and explained that he was too weak for visitors, that seeing me would only upset him. I'd stood on the front porch of my childhood home, looking up at his bedroom window, wondering if he even knew I'd tried to come. Now I wondered if he'd been up there, watching, maybe even recording Patricia's performance. I think, Mr. Henderson continued, that concludes the formal reading of the will. David, if you'd like to schedule a time to review your father's personal effects, including those recordings, my secretary can arrange that. Patricia stood abruptly, her chair rolling backward again. This is ridiculous. Bobby was sick, he was medicated, and he was being influenced by, she stopped mid-sentence, apparently realizing that any accusation she made about outside influence could easily be turned back on her. Influenced by whom? I asked quietly. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw her weighing her options, calculating her next move. Finally, she settled on righteous indignation. I won't stand here and listen to these implications about my marriage. Bobby and I loved each other. Whatever fantasy he concocted in his final weeks doesn't change 3 years of devotion. But as she gathered her purse and headed for the door, I noticed she didn't quite meet my eyes. And she didn't ask again about contesting the will. The door clicked shut behind Patricia, leaving an uncomfortable silence in the mahogany conference room. Mr. Henderson began organizing his papers with the methodical precision of someone who'd witnessed countless family implosions, but I could see him watching me from the corner of his eye. How long do I have before she can legally contest? I asked, my voice sounding hollow in the suddenly quiet space. In California, beneficiaries have 120 days from the date of filing to contest a will, he replied, sliding documents back into folders. However, given the medical documentation we have regarding your father's competency, and the fact that he specifically anticipated this possibility. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Let's just say I've seen much stronger cases fail spectacularly. I picked up the sealed envelope with my name on it, Dad's handwriting looking shakier than I remembered. My hands weren't entirely steady either. Mr. Henderson, can I ask you something? Of course. Did my father seem different when he came to change his will back in October? I mean, beyond the obvious physical changes. The older man leaned back in his chair, studying me over his wire-rimmed glasses. Your father was one of the most clear-headed clients I've ever worked with, David. Even in October, when he was obviously quite ill, his instructions were precise and methodical. He brought documentation, medical records, even a timeline of events he wanted me to understand. What kind of timeline? I probably shouldn't go into specifics until you've had a chance to review his personal effects. But I will say this, your father was a meticulous man. He documented dates, times, witnesses present. He even brought photographs. Photographs. The word sent a chill down my spine. Photographs of what? Mr. Henderson hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. David, your father believed that Patricia was systematically isolating him from you and other family members. He started paying attention to the details, when she claimed you'd called versus when you actually had, what she told him about your work schedule versus what he could verify through mutual friends. I thought about Uncle Jim, Dad's younger brother, who I hadn't seen at the funeral. When I'd asked Patricia about it, she'd said Jim was traveling and couldn't make it back in time. But Jim lived in Sacramento, barely 2 hours away. Did she? I started, then stopped. The question felt disloyal somehow, even now. Did she what? Did she keep people away from his funeral too? Mr. Henderson's expression grew somber. Your father left very specific instructions about his funeral arrangements. He wanted a small, private service. Patricia took some liberties with the guest list. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made my chest tight. How small did he want it? According to his written instructions. 27 people. He provided names and contact information. Mr. Henderson pulled out another folder. The actual service had 8 attendees, including yourself and Patricia. 8 people. Dad's funeral had felt oddly empty, but Patricia had explained it as his wish for privacy, his desire not to burden people. I'd felt guilty for wanting more, wanting his old poker buddies there, wanting Uncle Jim, wanting Dad's longtime neighbors the Kowalskis who used to watch me after school. The Kowalskis, I said suddenly. Stan and Marie next door. Were they on his list? Mr. Henderson consulted the document. Stanley and Marie Kowalski, yes. Listed as number 4 and 5. I remembered Stan coming over the day after Dad died, how Patricia had spoken to him through the screen door, explaining that Dad had wanted to keep things simple, family only. Stan had looked confused, had mentioned something about Dad asking him to be a pallbearer just a month earlier. Patricia had smoothly explained that Dad had changed his mind, that the cancer had made him want to minimize the burden on friends. Jesus, I whispered. David, I want you to understand something, Mr. Henderson said, his voice taking on a more personal tone than he'd used during the official reading. I've been practicing estate law for 42 years. I've seen every kind of family dynamic, every form of manipulation and influence. What Patricia did to your father, and to you, was systematic and calculated. Your father recognized that, and he took steps to document it. The envelope in my hand suddenly felt heavier. The recordings he made, do you know what's on them? I hadn't listened to them personally, but your father provided summaries. Phone calls where Patricia pretended to be speaking to you, then told him you declined to visit. Conversations where she discussed your father's assets with someone else, someone she believed wasn't listening. And he hesitated again. And what? Discussions about accelerating certain financial transfers. Moving money from accounts your father had established for his care into joint accounts she could access more easily. The room seemed to tilt slightly. She was stealing from him. That would be for law enforcement to determine. But your father was concerned enough to move his assets back into accounts she couldn't touch. The joint savings account I mentioned. It contained nearly $200,000 in September. By the time of his death, it held $47,000. I felt sick. While Dad was dying, while I was being kept at arm's length by a woman I'd trusted with his care, she'd been systematically looting his accounts. Where did the money go? That, Mr. Henderson said grimly, is something those recordings might help explain. Your father wasn't just documenting her treatment of you, David. He was building a case. A case. The words echoed in my head as I sat in my car outside Henderson's office, Dad's letter still unopened on the passenger seat. The October afternoon was crisp, the kind of day Dad used to love for working in the yard. Instead of grieving, I was learning that his final months had been spent playing detective in his own home. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Jake, Uncle Jim's son. Dude, why didn't anyone tell us about Uncle Rob's funeral? Dad's been trying to reach you for weeks. I stared at the message, then dialed Jake's number. He picked up on the first ring. David? Jesus, we've been worried sick. Patricia said you didn't want family bothering you while you grieved, but that didn't sound like you. She told you what? Yeah, Dad called her like 3 days after the funeral. He only found out through Mom's Facebook, if you can believe that. Patricia said Uncle Rob specifically didn't want his brother there, that there was some old argument about money. Dad and Uncle Jim had never argued about anything more serious than football teams. Jake, there was no argument. Patricia lied to you. Silence on the other end. Then, what do you mean she lied? I found myself explaining everything, the will, the recordings, the systematic isolation. Jake listened without interrupting, but I could hear him breathing harder as the story went on. That fucking bitch, he finally said. Sorry, I know she's technically your stepmom, but don't apologize. I'm starting to think that's the kindest thing anyone's called her. David, there's something else. Dad tried to visit Uncle Rob in September, drove down from Sacramento unannounced. Patricia met him at the door, said Uncle Rob was sleeping and that he'd been asking not to see people because he was embarrassed about how he looked. Another lie. Dad had never been vain about his appearance, even during chemo. Did Uncle Jim believe her? He thought it was weird, but what was he gonna do? Force his way into a cancer patient's bedroom? Jake paused. But here's the thing, Dad saw Uncle Rob's car keys on the hall table. If he was too sick for visitors, why were his keys sitting right there like he'd just gotten home? I felt my grip tighten on the phone. What day in September? Let me ask him. I heard muffled conversation in the background. September 10th, Dad remembers because it was the day before his wedding anniversary. September 10th. 2 days after Henderson said Dad had started making recordings. Jake, I think Patricia was taking Dad places and not telling anyone. Maybe to move money around, maybe to sign papers. Jesus Christ. What are you gonna do? I looked at the envelope again, at Dad's shaky handwriting spelling out my name. I'm going to listen to those recordings. All of them. You want company? I can drive down tomorrow. The offer caught me off guard. After 3 years of Patricia convincing Dad that his family didn't care enough to visit, the idea of actually having support felt foreign. Yeah, I said, surprised by how much I meant it. Yeah, I'd like that. After Jake hung up, I finally opened Dad's letter. His handwriting was shakier than usual, but still recognizably his. Asterisk David, if you're reading this, then Henderson did his job and Patricia got the surprise she deserved. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what she was doing to us. I thought I was protecting you from my illness, but she was protecting herself from my family. The recordings will explain everything. Trust Henderson, trust yourself, and know that I never stopped being proud of you. Love, Dad. P.S. Check the garage freezer, asterisk. The garage freezer. We'd had the same ancient chest freezer since I was 12. What could possibly be? My phone rang. Patricia's number. You son of a bitch, she hissed before I could even say hello. You think you're so clever. Hello, Patricia. Those recordings are fake. Fabricated. Your father was delusional from pain medication. According to his medical records, he wasn't on anything stronger than tramadol until his final 2 weeks. The silence stretched long enough that I thought she might have hung up. What do you want? She finally asked. What do I want? I repeated, sitting in my car outside Henderson's office with Dad's letter still trembling in my hands. I want to know why you stole $150,000 from a dying man. The sharp intake of breath on the other end told me I'd hit home. Patricia recovered quickly though, she always did. I have no idea what you're talking about. Every financial decision your father and I made was joint. I was his wife, David. His legal next of kin. His legal next of kin who somehow forgot to invite his brother to the funeral. His legal next of kin who told the Kowalskis that Dad wanted family only when they'd been his neighbors for 15 years. Your father was very specific about bullshit. The word came out harder than I'd intended. I have Dad's written funeral instructions, Patricia. 27 people. You invited 8. Another long silence. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into that wounded tone that used to make Dad rush to comfort her. David, I know you're grieving. I know you're looking for someone to blame for losing your father. But we both loved Bobby, and we both did what we thought was best. Cut the act. I was surprised by how calm I sounded. I know about the recordings. I know about the joint account that went from $200,000 to $47,000 in 2 months. And I'm going to find out where that money went. You can't prove anything. The mask slipped again, just for a moment. Those recordings are the paranoid delusions of a sick man. No court would. She stopped abruptly, apparently realizing she'd just admitted the recordings existed. No court would what, Patricia? This conversation is over. You'll be hearing from my attorney. She hung up, but not before I caught something in the background, a man's voice, too distant to make out words but close enough to suggest she wasn't alone. Interesting. I sat in the parking lot for another few minutes, processing everything. The garage freezer. Dad's postscript felt almost surreal after everything else, but I knew him well enough to know he didn't include details randomly. Whatever was in that freezer, he'd wanted me to find it. The drive to Maple Grove Lane felt like moving backward through time. Every street corner held memories, the park where Dad taught me to throw a curveball, the corner store where he'd buy me baseball cards, the house where the Kowalskis still lived, probably wondering why their longtime friend had apparently cut them out of his final goodbye. I pulled into the driveway, using the key Henderson had given me. The house felt different already, like Patricia's presence had somehow changed the molecular structure of the air. Dad's favorite chair sat empty in the living room, but the throw pillows had been rearranged, made more decorative. Even in death, she was erasing him. The garage was exactly as I remembered, Dad's workbench still covered with half-finished projects, his toolbox organized with military precision. The ancient chest freezer hummed in the corner, same as always. I lifted the heavy lid, expecting to find the usual collection of frozen vegetables and bulk meat purchases. Instead, sitting on top of everything else, was a manila envelope marked, David, copies, in Dad's handwriting. Copies of what? I grabbed the envelope and headed back inside, spreading its contents across the kitchen table. Bank statements, photocopies of checks, printed emails, and what looked like a handwritten log in Dad's meticulous script. The first entry was dated September 3rd. P. Told David I was too tired for his call. David never called today. Checked phone records, last incoming call was Tuesday. My chest tightened as I flipped through page after page of similar entries. Dad had been methodically documenting every lie, every manipulation, every discrepancy between what Patricia told him and what actually happened. September 15th, P. says she spoke to Jim, that he's too busy with his own family to visit. Called Jim directly while P. was at grocery store. He says no one contacted him about my condition. September 22nd, found check stub in PS purse, $15,000 M. Santos Construction, dated yesterday. No construction happening on property. P. says payment was for future landscaping. October 1st, overheard P. on phone in kitchen, once the old man dies, we can pay off your debts and start fresh. Caller unknown. Recording device ordered from Amazon. There it was, the moment Dad decided to start gathering evidence. I kept reading, my hands growing steadier with each revelation. October 8th, David's birthday. P. told me she called to invite him for dinner, says he was too busy to come. Called David myself from bedroom phone while P. was out. He never received any call. We talked for an hour. First real conversation in months. I remembered that call. Dad had sounded different, more like himself than he'd been in over a year. He'd asked detailed questions about my job, my apartment, my girlfriend Sarah whom I'd been afraid to mention around Patricia. At the time, I'd attributed his renewed interest to facing his mortality. Now I realized it was something else entirely. He was fact-checking everything Patricia had told him about my life. The final entry was dated October 27th, just 5 days before he died. P. doesn't know I changed well back yesterday. Recording device hidden in bedroom bookshelf will continue running until battery dies. If something happens to me before I can give these documents to David, Henderson has backup copies in office safe. Patricia Santos is not who she claims to be. Marriage certificate shows her previous name as Patricia Santos Martinez. Divorced, not widowed. No cancer history. M. Santos, her brother. Ex-husband. Need more time to investigate. Patricia Santos Martinez. Not the grieving widow who'd met Dad at a cancer support group, but someone with an entirely different history. Someone who'd built their relationship on a foundation of lies. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. Dad wants to know if you need help cleaning out Uncle Rob's house. Also says to tell you he saved all Uncle Rob's voicemails from the past 6 months. Voicemails. More evidence of Dad trying to maintain family connections while Patricia systematically cut the phone lines. I was still staring at the documents when I heard a car door slam outside. Through the front window, I saw Patricia marching up the walkway, and she wasn't alone. A heavy-set man in his 40s walked beside her, wearing an expensive suit that didn't quite hide the predatory look in his eyes. Patricia had her key out, but stopped when she saw my car in the driveway. She said something to the man, who nodded and headed back toward a black BMW parked across the street. She came through the front door like she owned the place, which, until 24 hours ago, she probably thought she did. David. Her voice was cold, controlled. We need to talk. Actually, Patricia, I don't think we do. I kept my voice level, but I didn't get up from the kitchen table where Dad's documents were spread out like evidence at a crime scene. This isn't your house anymore. You have 29 days to collect your belongings and leave. She stepped into the kitchen, her eyes immediately going to the papers in front of me. I watched her face change as she recognized Dad's handwriting, saw the bank statements, spotted the words, Patricia Santos Martinez, written in his careful script. Where did you get those? The mask was completely gone now. No more grieving widow, no more wounded stepmother. Just cold calculation. Dad left them for me. Along with some very interesting questions about your real identity. I picked up one of the bank statements, made a show of studying it. Like why Patricia Santos needed $15,000 from a dying man's account. Those documents are private. They belong to me as much as. Actually, they don't. I stood up, grateful that I had 4 inches of height on her. Everything in this house belongs to me now. Including Dad's investigation into who you really are. For the first time since I'd known her, Patricia looked genuinely rattled. She glanced toward the front window, probably checking on her friend in the BMW, then back at me. You don't understand what you're dealing with, David. Your father was sick. Paranoid. He started imagining conspiracies that didn't exist. Paranoid enough to verify his phone records. Paranoid enough to call Uncle Jim directly and discover you'd been lying about him for months. I tapped the handwritten log. Dad documented everything, Patricia. Every lie you told, every person you kept away, every dollar you moved out of his accounts. She moved closer to the table, trying to read the documents upside down. That money was for his care. Medical expenses, home improvements to make him more comfortable. $15,000 to M. Santos Construction. What kind of medical expense was that? Patricia's face went white. How did you? The same way Dad did. By paying attention. I gathered up the papers, holding them against my chest. Who's M. Santos, Patricia? Your brother. Your ex-husband. The man sitting in the BMW outside. She backed toward the door, but I could see her mind working, calculating her next move. You can't prove anything with a bunch of paranoid scribbles. Maybe not. But I bet the IRS would be very interested in a $15,000 payment to a construction company that doesn't seem to exist. And I'm sure the district attorney would love to hear Dad's recordings of you discussing his death while he was still alive. Those recordings are inadmissible. California is a two-party consent state. She stopped mid-sentence, realizing she'd just confirmed that she knew exactly what was on those recordings. You're right, I said calmly. But they don't need to be admissible in court to be very interesting to a probate judge reviewing your will contest. Or to the medical board investigating whether someone forged cancer treatment records to infiltrate a support group. Patricia's hand found the doorframe, steadying herself. You have no idea what you're starting. I'm not starting anything. I'm finishing what Dad started. I moved toward her, and she stepped backward onto the front porch. You have 29 days, Patricia. Pack your things and go back to whatever rock you crawled out from under. The man outside, she said quietly. That's Miguel Santos. My brother. He has a very different perspective on how this situation should be resolved. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. She pulled out her phone, started dialing. Miguel. We have a problem. I closed the door and locked it, my hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline caught up with me. Through the window, I watched Patricia pace the front yard while talking animatedly to her brother. Miguel got out of the BMW, and even from a distance, I could see this wasn't a man who solved problems through legal channels. My phone rang. Jake. Change of plans, I said before he could speak. Can you get here tonight instead of tomorrow? And maybe bring Uncle Jim with you. What's wrong? I think I just kicked a hornet's nest. Through the kitchen window, I watched Miguel Santos circle my car like a predator sizing up prey. He was taking photos of my license plate with his phone, methodically documenting details. Patricia stood near the mailbox, still talking rapidly, gesturing toward the house every few seconds. I called Jake back. How fast can you and Uncle Jim get here? We're already in the car. Dad grabbed his shotgun when I told him about Patricia. Should be there by 8:30. Jake paused. David, you said her real name is Santos Martinez. Dad thinks he recognizes that name. From where? Give me a second. I heard muffled conversation, then Jake came back on. Dad says there was a Santos Martinez in the news about 5 years ago. Some kind of insurance fraud case up in Fresno. Woman who married 3 different men with terminal illnesses, collected life insurance payouts. My blood went cold. 3 men. Dad's trying to remember details. Says the case fell apart because one of the husbands survived his cancer and started talking to investigators. More muffled discussion. David, Dad says get out of that house. Now. If this is the same woman. The line went dead. I tried calling back, but the call went straight to voicemail. Outside, Patricia was walking back toward the front door, but Miguel had disappeared. I couldn't see the BMW anymore either. A sound from the back of the house made me freeze, the distinctive creak of the wooden gate that led from the alley to Dad's backyard. The gate that had needed WD-40 for the past 10 years, the one that announced visitors like an alarm bell. I grabbed Dad's documents and shoved them into the manila envelope, then stuffed everything inside my jacket. The kitchen had 2 exits, the front hallway where Patricia was probably heading, and the side door that led to the garage. Another creak, closer now. Footsteps on the back deck. I moved toward the garage, trying to keep my footsteps quiet on the hardwood floors. Dad's house had never felt this big before, every shadow suddenly menacing, every familiar sound transformed into potential danger. The side door lock turned easily, and I slipped into the garage just as I heard the back door handle rattle. Miguel was trying to get in through the kitchen. My car keys were in my pocket, but my car was in the driveway, right where Miguel had been photographing it. The garage had a back exit though, a narrow door that opened onto the alley behind the house. Dad used to use it for taking out trash cans. I was halfway to the alley door when the garage lights flicked on. Going somewhere? Patricia stood in the doorway between the garage and kitchen, her hand still on the light switch. Behind her, I could see Miguel's bulk filling the kitchen doorway. Just getting some air, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Lot of revelations today. Indeed. She stepped into the garage, and Miguel followed. Up close, he was even more intimidating, 6'3", maybe 250, with the kind of scars that suggested he'd been in situations where diplomacy failed. Miguel thinks we should discuss this situation more privately. I'm fine discussing it right here. Miguel spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent. Your stepmother is very upset, David. She thinks you have the wrong impression about her relationship with your father. My impression is based on bank records and recorded conversations. Pretty hard to misinterpret. Recordings can be edited, Miguel said, moving closer. Bank records can be misunderstood. Family disputes get complicated when people start making accusations they can't prove. I took a step backward, bumping into Dad's workbench. Tools rattled in their organized containers, wrenches, screwdrivers, the electric drill he'd used to build my treehouse 20 years ago. Here's what's going to happen, Patricia said, her voice taking on that familiar controlling tone. You're going to give me those documents you took from the freezer. You're going to forget about those recordings. And you're going to sign papers agreeing that the October will was invalid due to your father's diminished mental capacity. And if I don't? Miguel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Family disputes can turn tragic. Grieving stepson, overwhelmed by loss, makes some very poor decisions. The threat hung in the garage air like exhaust fumes. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, could feel the manila envelope crinkled against my ribs where I'd hidden it inside my jacket. Then I heard something else, car doors slamming in the driveway. Multiple car doors. Miguel's head snapped toward the sound, and Patricia moved to the small garage window that faced the street. Shit, she whispered. There are 3 cars out there. Uncle Jim's voice carried through the evening air, loud and unmistakably angry. Patricia. Get your ass out here. We need to talk. The sound of Uncle Jim's voice cut through the garage like a lifeline. Miguel's confident demeanor shifted instantly, his eyes darting between the window and the alley door behind me. Patricia pressed herself against the glass, trying to get a better view of the driveway. Who the fuck did you call? Miguel hissed, grabbing my arm hard enough to leave bruises. Language, Miguel, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. There are neighbors around. Through the thin garage walls, I could hear more voices, Jake, definitely, but also at least two others I didn't recognize. Uncle Jim's voice boomed again, David's car is here, so I know you haven't hurt him yet. But Patricia, I swear to God, if you and your boyfriend have laid one finger on my nephew. Boyfriend? I looked between Patricia and Miguel, pieces clicking into place. Let me guess. Not siblings after all. Patricia's face cycled through several expressions before settling on cold fury. Miguel, we're leaving. Now. What about the documents? Miguel's grip on my arm tightened. What about the plan? The plan just went to shit. She moved toward the kitchen door, but stopped when voices grew louder outside. Is there another way out of here? I almost pointed toward the alley door, then caught myself. Why would I help you escape? Miguel's free hand went inside his jacket, and I caught a glimpse of something metallic. Because you want to see tomorrow. Before I could respond, the front doorbell rang. Then someone started pounding on the front door hard enough to rattle the windows. David. Uncle Jim's voice carried through the house. If you can hear me, we're coming in. They can't just break in, Patricia said, but her voice had lost its commanding edge. That's breaking and entering. Actually, I said, working to keep Miguel distracted while more cars arrived outside, since I inherited the house this morning, I can invite anyone I want inside. And I definitely invited Uncle Jim. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Uncle Jim had apparently decided not to wait for an invitation. Kitchen's clear. Jake's voice. David? Where are you? Garage. I shouted, and Miguel's hand moved faster toward whatever was inside his jacket. The kitchen door burst open, and Jake appeared with Uncle Jim right behind him. But they weren't alone, two men in khaki uniforms followed them into the garage. Sheriff's Department, the first officer announced, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. We got a call about a possible domestic disturbance. Miguel's hand froze halfway to his jacket. Patricia backed against the workbench, trapped between Uncle Jim's furious glare and the deputy's professional assessment of the situation. Officer Martinez, the second deputy said, reading from a small notepad, we've had some interesting conversations with your neighbors about activity at this address. Mr. Kowalski next door says he's seen you removing items from the house at unusual hours. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I live here. Lived here. I have every right to. Had every right, Uncle Jim corrected, his voice carrying 40 years of barely contained dislike for his brother's second wife. Past tense. As of this morning, you're trespassing. The first deputy looked at me. Mr. Mitchell. Are these people here with your permission? Absolutely not. I shrugged out of Miguel's loosened grip, putting distance between us. In fact, I'd like to report a theft. Patricia Santos Martinez removed approximately $150,000 from my father's accounts in the 2 months before his death. That's a serious accusation, the deputy said, pulling out handcuffs. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning. Miguel made his move then, lunging toward the alley door. But Uncle Jim had positioned himself perfectly, and 40 years of construction work had kept him strong. Miguel hit the concrete floor hard, with Jim's knee planted firmly in his back. Attempted flight, the second deputy observed, moving to cuff Miguel. Always makes us more interested in what someone might be hiding. As they led Patricia and Miguel away, Patricia turned back toward me with pure venom in her eyes. This isn't over, David. Those recordings won't hold up in court, and you can't prove where that money went. Maybe not, I said, pulling the manila envelope out of my jacket. But Detective Rodriguez from Fresno PD is very interested in talking to you about 3 other widowers who died under suspicious circumstances. Apparently, your insurance fraud case from 5 years ago was never officially closed. The color drained from Patricia's face completely. What are you talking about? Uncle Jim stepped forward, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd been waiting 3 years to say his piece. Robert Martinez, died 2019. Kevin Santos, died 2020. Thomas Martinez, died 2021. All cancer patients. All married to women named Patricia Santos Martinez in the months before their deaths. He smiled grimly. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look. The silence in the garage after Patricia and Miguel were led away felt almost surreal. Uncle Jim stood dusting off his hands like he'd just finished a routine home repair project instead of helping arrest 2 people who'd been threatening his nephew. Jesus, David, Jake said, running his hands through his hair. When you said you kicked a hornet's nest, you weren't kidding. Detective Rodriguez from Fresno PD arrived 45 minutes later, a compact woman in her 50s with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing. She spread Dad's documents across the kitchen table like she was assembling a puzzle she'd been working on for years. Your father was remarkably thorough, she said, scanning through his handwritten logs. Most victims of this kind of long-term fraud never see it coming, let alone document it in real time. How long have you been tracking Patricia? I asked, settling into Dad's chair at the head of the table. Officially. 3 years. Unofficially. 5. Rodriguez pulled out a thick folder. Patricia Santos Martinez, she's used at least 6 different name combinations, has been on our radar since the Robert Martinez case in 2019. 73-year-old widower, prostate cancer, married Patricia after meeting her at a support group in Bakersfield. Uncle Jim leaned forward. Same playbook as Bobby. Identical. Right down to the systematic isolation from family members. Rodriguez flipped through crime scene photos. Robert Martinez died at home, apparently from complications related to his cancer treatment. But his daughter found irregularities in his medication schedule, discrepancies in his financial records. Did Patricia inherit everything? Jake asked. $2.7 million. The daughter contested, but Patricia had been very careful about documentation. Forged medical records showing Robert's mental decline, testimony from witnesses who claimed the family had abandoned him. Rodriguez looked directly at me. Sound familiar? The parallels were chilling. What happened to the investigation? Stalled. Patricia disappeared for 8 months, resurfaced in Modesto as Patricia Santos, met Kevin Santos, no relation, despite the name. 68 years old, lung cancer, recently divorced. Rodriguez pulled out another file. Kevin lasted 14 months. His ex-wife tried to warn him, but Patricia had convinced him that his family was only after his money. And the third one? Uncle Jim's voice was tight with barely contained rage. Thomas Martinez in Sacramento. Brain tumor. Patricia had gotten even better at the game by then. She'd learned to space out the financial transfers, create more plausible documentation for her presence in their lives. Rodriguez closed the folder. Thomas lasted 11 months. His brother hired a private investigator, but by the time they built a case, Patricia had vanished again. I thought about Dad's final months, how isolated I'd felt, how guilty Patricia had made me feel for not being there enough. How much did she steal from all of them combined? Conservative estimate. $7 million. Rodriguez's expression grew grim. But here's what makes your father's case different, David. He started fighting back before it was too late. She pulled out a digital recorder, the same model I'd seen advertised on Amazon. Your father wasn't just documenting Patricia's lies. He was building a federal case. Financial fraud across state lines, mail fraud, wire fraud, elder abuse. The FBI has been waiting for a victim with this level of documentation. The FBI. Jake straightened in his chair. Patricia Santos Martinez just became a federal fugitive. Those recordings your father made? They're not just family drama anymore, they're evidence in a multi-state investigation. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since arriving. She picked the wrong target when she chose your father. Uncle Jim pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages. Speaking of which, detective, you need to see this. He handed her the phone. Stan Kowalski just sent me security camera footage from his front door. Shows Patricia loading boxes into that BMW every night this week, always between midnight and 3 a.m. Rodriguez studied the phone screen, her expression growing more satisfied by the second. Destroying evidence, removing assets, she's been busy. She looked up at me. David, how quickly can you get me access to those recordings your father made? Henderson has them in his office safe. I can call him right now. Do it. And David? Rodriguez stood, gathering her files. Your father saved more than just his own estate. When we nail Patricia Santos Martinez, we're going to recover assets from all 4 cases. 3 other families are going to get justice because your dad was smart enough to document everything. As Rodriguez left, Uncle Jim put his hand on my shoulder. Bobby would be proud of you, son. Standing up to her like that took guts. I had help, I said, looking around the kitchen table where 3 generations of Mitchell men had gathered to fight back against a predator. Besides, Dad did all the heavy lifting. I just had to be brave enough to open his freezer. Jake laughed despite everything. Leave it to Uncle Rob to hide evidence next to the frozen peas. Outside, I could see the Kowalskis standing in their yard, watching the police cars with obvious relief. Stan waved when he saw me through the window, and I realized that for the first time in 3 years, I could walk over there without Patricia intercepting the conversation. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This isn't over. You have no idea what you've started. I showed it to Uncle Jim, who snorted. Patricia's going to have bigger problems than revenge fantasies. Federal prison tends to keep people pretty busy. But as I looked out at the empty driveway where Patricia's Mercedes had been parked just hours ago, I couldn't shake the feeling that Detective Rodriguez was right. Dad had picked a fight with someone who'd been getting away with murder for years. And now that fight was mine to finish. The next morning brought another surprise. I was sorting through Dad's desk when Henderson called with news that made my coffee go cold. David, we have a problem. Patricia's attorney filed an emergency injunction this morning, claiming the recordings were obtained illegally. They're demanding all audio evidence be sealed pending a competency hearing. Can they do that? They're certainly trying. Judge Morrison granted a temporary restraining order. We can't release the recordings to Detective Rodriguez until Thursday's hearing. Henderson's voice carried the frustration of a man who'd seen too many legal maneuvers over the decades. There's more. Patricia's legal team includes Marcus Webb. The name meant nothing to me, but Henderson's tone suggested it should. Webb specializes in elder law and competency cases. He's expensive, David. Retainer starts at $50,000. Question is, where did Patricia get that kind of money for legal fees? I thought about the missing $150,000 from Dad's joint account. Same place she got everything else. Possibly. But Webb's involvement suggests this isn't just about your father's estate anymore. This is about keeping Patricia out of federal prison. After Henderson hung up, I found myself staring at Dad's handwritten timeline again. October 15th jumped out at me. P. Received registered letter from law office in Phoenix. Claimed it was about her mother's estate, but became agitated when I asked about funeral arrangements. Says mother was cremated immediately, no service. Phoenix. I grabbed my laptop and started searching for Patricia Santos Martinez, Phoenix, Arizona. The third result made my stomach drop. An obituary from the Arizona Republic, dated October 12, Santos, Elena Marie, 67, passed peacefully at Desert Regional Medical Center surrounded by family. Survived by daughters Maria Santos Chin and Patricia Santos Martinez. Elena Santos had died in Phoenix on October 10th. But according to Dad's timeline, Patricia had received legal correspondence about her mother's estate 5 days later. Why would there be estate issues if Elena had died peacefully surrounded by family? I called the number listed for Sunset Memorial Gardens in Phoenix, where Elena was supposedly cremated. Memorial Services, this is Janet. Hi, I'm calling about Elena Santos, who passed on October 10th. I'm trying to reach her daughter Patricia about the memorial service. A pause. Sir, I'm not showing any Elena Santos in our records from that date. Are you sure you have the right facility? The obituary listed Sunset Memorial Gardens specifically. Let me check our October records more thoroughly. Typing sounds. Sir, we haven't had anyone by that name. Are you certain about the date and spelling? I hung up and called the Arizona Republic directly. After being transferred 3 times, I reached the obituaries department. That obituary was placed and paid for online, the clerk confirmed. Payment was made with a credit card registered to Patricia Martinez in Fresno, California. Patricia had faked her own mother's death. But why? My phone rang, Detective Rodriguez. David, I need you to stay alert. We attempted to arrest Patricia this morning at the Marriott downtown, but the room was empty. Hotel says she checked out at 4 a.m., but housekeeping found something interesting. Papers rustled in the background. Handwritten notes about accessing your father's safe deposit box. Did you know he had one? Safe deposit box. The words hit me like ice water. Henderson never mentioned. Because it wasn't listed in the will. We found the key taped under Patricia's hotel room desk, along with bank documents from Security First National. Box was opened yesterday at 3:47 p.m., just hours after the will reading. The implications crashed over me. While I'd been celebrating Dad's final victory, Patricia had been cleaning out assets I didn't even know existed. What was in the box? That's what we're trying to determine. Bank manager says it contained documents and what appeared to be jewelry. Patricia presented a death certificate and power of attorney, both looked legitimate at the time. Forged? Most likely. David, there's something else. We ran Patricia's credit card records. She's been making payments to a private investigator in Sacramento for the past 6 months. Someone's been watching your father's house, photographing visitors, documenting schedules. The surveillance explained how Patricia always knew exactly when I was planning to visit, how she managed to intercept every attempt at family contact. Dad hadn't just been fighting one person, he'd been up against a professional operation. Rodriguez, I think Patricia faked her mother's death in Phoenix to create an inheritance story. She's been planning her exit strategy since October. Interesting. Why fake a death? Because dead people can't contradict your story about sudden windfalls of cash. If anyone asks where her money came from, she points to Mom's estate in Arizona. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. David, I want you to pack a bag and stay somewhere else tonight. If Patricia's desperate enough to forge documents and hire surveillance, she might escalate to more direct methods. The thought of leaving Dad's house felt like abandoning him all over again. But as I looked around the kitchen where we'd confronted Patricia just 18 hours ago, I realized Detective Rodriguez was right. Patricia Santos Martinez had killed 3 men and stolen $7 million over 5 years. Dad's recordings had threatened to end her career permanently. People with that much to lose didn't give up easily. I was throwing clothes into a duffel bag when Jake called with news that made my hands freeze on the zipper. David, you need to get over here right now. Dad found something in Uncle Rob's voicemails that changes everything. I can't leave the house right now. Rodriguez thinks Patricia might. Bring Rodriguez with you. This is about more than just Patricia. Jake's voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before. Dad's been going through Uncle Rob's phone records, cross-referencing them with the timeline you showed us. Patricia wasn't working alone, and she wasn't just stealing money. 20 minutes later, I sat in Uncle Jim's living room with Detective Rodriguez, watching my uncle pace back and forth like a caged animal. His dining table was covered with printed phone records, bank statements, and what looked like medical documents. Tell them what you found, Jake said, his face grim. Uncle Jim stopped pacing and fixed his eyes on me. David, your father called me 17 times in his final month. 17 calls that Patricia claimed never happened. But here's the thing, Bobby wasn't just documenting Patricia's lies. He was investigating her background, and he found something that scared him enough to change his will back immediately. Rodriguez leaned forward in her chair. What kind of something? Patricia Santos Martinez isn't just a gold digger, detective. She's part of a network. Uncle Jim pulled out a folder thick with printouts. Bobby traced her previous marriages, looked into the deaths of Robert Martinez, Kevin Santos, and Thomas Martinez. All 3 men died exactly 14 days after changing their wills to benefit Patricia. The number hit me like a physical blow. 14 days. Bobby died 16 days after changing his will back, Jake said quietly. 2 days longer than her usual timeline. Rodriguez was already on her phone, calling her partner. Martinez here. I need you to pull the exact dates of death versus will changes for all 3 previous victims. Yes, I'll hold. Uncle Jim continued, his voice getting darker. But here's what really spooked Bobby. He found medical records showing that all 3 men received experimental pain treatments in their final weeks. Treatments administered by a private nursing service called Comfort Care Medical Solutions. Let me guess, I said, my stomach sinking. Patricia recommended this service. Not just recommended. She owns it. Uncle Jim handed me a corporate filing document. Comfort Care Medical Solutions, incorporated in Nevada 3 years ago. Sole proprietor, Patricia Santos Martinez. Licensed to provide in-home medical care for terminal patients. Rodriguez ended her call, her face pale. 14 days exactly for all 3 victims. And David, there's more. Toxicology reports from Thomas Martinez's autopsy showed elevated levels of morphine and potassium chloride in his system. His family requested the autopsy because he'd been improving before his sudden decline. The room went quiet except for the ticking of Uncle Jim's grandfather clock. I thought about Dad's final weeks, how quickly he deteriorated after Patricia hired that new nurse, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd supposedly come so highly recommended. Dad had a nurse in his final month, I said slowly. Patricia said she was from some medical service, that insurance was covering it. What was her name? Rodriguez asked, already pulling out her notepad. Carmen Rodriguez. She came 3 times a week, managed Dad's medications, monitored his condition. I felt sick as the pieces clicked together. Patricia said she was a godsend, that Dad was much more comfortable with professional care. Uncle Jim was already searching on his laptop. Carmen Rodriguez, licensed practical nurse, here she is. Employee of Comfort Care Medical Solutions for the past 2 years. Before that, she worked for Sunset Healthcare in Modesto, the same company that provided nursing care for Kevin Santos. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez muttered. Patricia's been running a murder-for-hire operation disguised as a medical service. My phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. Your father suffered because he couldn't leave well enough alone. Don't make his mistake. I showed it to Rodriguez, who immediately forwarded it to her partner. We're tracing this number, but I'm betting it's a burner phone. She looked at me seriously. David, I'm putting you in protective custody until we locate Patricia. What about the will contest hearing on Thursday? The hearing's the least of our problems. If Patricia killed your father to prevent him from exposing her operation, she's not going to let you walk into that courtroom with his evidence. Uncle Jim closed his laptop and looked at me with the same expression he'd worn at Mom's funeral, protective, determined, and absolutely furious. Bobby figured out what Patricia was doing, didn't he? That's why he changed his will back so suddenly. I nodded, remembering Dad's final entry in his handwritten log, need more time to investigate. He'd run out of time, but he'd given me everything I needed to finish what he'd started. Rodriguez, I said, standing up and shouldering my duffel bag. How fast can we get those recordings released? Because if Patricia's been murdering people for 5 years, Thursday's hearing isn't about my inheritance anymore. What is it about? I looked around the room at the evidence spread across Uncle Jim's table, bank records, medical documents, corporate filings, and phone logs that painted a picture of systematic murder disguised as compassionate care. It's about making sure she never kills anyone else. The protective custody safe house turned out to be a cramped apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant in downtown Sacramento. Detective Rodriguez assured me it was temporary, just until they could locate Patricia and her network, but the thin walls and the smell of fish sauce weren't doing much for my nerves. At 2 a.m., I was still awake, scrolling through Dad's documents on my laptop when Rodriguez called. We found Carmen Rodriguez, she said without preamble. She's been very talkative once we explained her legal situation. I sat up straighter on the uncomfortable couch. What did she say? Patricia's operation was more sophisticated than we thought. Carmen wasn't just administering medications, she was documenting everything. Patricia required detailed logs of each patient's decline, precise timing of symptoms, even photographs. Rodriguez's voice carried barely contained disgust. She kept records like it was a medical study. Records of what? How long it took each victim to die after she started the enhanced pain management protocol. Patricia was perfecting her technique, David. Your father lasted 16 days instead of 14 because he was stronger than her previous targets. The words hit me like physical blows. Dad had fought back for 2 extra days, even while being slowly poisoned by someone he trusted. There's more, Rodriguez continued. Carmen says Patricia panicked when your father changed his will back in October. She moved up the timeline, increased dosages, but your father was too stubborn to die on schedule. That's why she seemed so desperate at the will reading. Exactly. Patricia had already spent money she expected to inherit, made commitments to Miguel Santos and others in her network. When your father survived past her deadline and restored his original will, her entire operation started falling apart. I thought about Patricia's face when Henderson had read Dad's final instructions, the shock that had seemed so genuine. She hadn't just been surprised about losing the inheritance, she'd been panicked about her carefully orchestrated timeline failing. Rodriguez, where is Patricia now? That's the problem. Carmen says Patricia has multiple identities prepared, safe deposit boxes in 3 states, and enough cash to disappear permanently. But she also says Patricia won't run until she retrieves something from your father's house. My blood went cold. What could she possibly need from there? We already found Dad's documents in the freezer. Carmen doesn't know specifics, but Patricia mentioned something about insurance policies your father hid in the house. Not life insurance, something else. Carmen heard Patricia on the phone with someone, saying they needed to find the policies before the FBI seized the property. Insurance policies. I tried to remember if Dad had ever mentioned anything beyond his standard life insurance through work. Then something clicked, a conversation from years ago, right after Mom died. Rodriguez, my dad worked for Pacific Insurance for 37 years. He used to joke that insurance guys always had insurance on their insurance. I stood up, pacing the small apartment. What if he took out policies on Patricia? What do you mean? Dad was methodical about everything. If he suspected Patricia was dangerous, he might have taken out accidental death policies, disability coverage, anything that would pay out if something happened to him under suspicious circumstances. The idea was gaining momentum in my head. Insurance companies investigate claims thoroughly, especially large payouts. Dad would have known that. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. David, if your father purchased insurance policies specifically to expose Patricia's operation, those policies would be evidence. Documentary proof that Dad knew his life was in danger. I grabbed my jacket. Rodriguez, I need to get back to the house. Absolutely not. If Patricia is planning to retrieve those policies, we're not walking into. She's going to destroy them. Whatever Dad set up as his final insurance policy against Patricia, she can't let it survive. I was already heading for the door. How long would it take her to search a 3-bedroom house? David, stop. We'll get a warrant, bring a full team. By morning, those policies will be gone and Patricia will be on a plane to somewhere without extradition treaties. I stopped at the door, phone pressed to my ear. Rodriguez, my father spent his last months fighting this woman. He documented everything, recorded her conversations, even faked taking medication so he could stay lucid enough to gather evidence. I'm not going to let his final plan fail because I was too scared to help finish it. The silence stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. 30 minutes, Rodriguez finally said. I'm calling for backup, and you don't move until we have the house surrounded. Patricia Santos Martinez has killed 4 people that we know of, David. I'm not letting her make it 5. As I waited for Rodriguez's team, I called Uncle Jim. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been expecting bad news. They found Carmen Rodriguez, I told him. Dad was being poisoned for over a month. The silence on Uncle Jim's end was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. Where's Patricia now? Probably on her way to Dad's house. Rodriguez thinks Dad hid insurance policies somewhere inside, evidence that could expose Patricia's entire operation. Insurance policies. Uncle Jim's voice carried a note I'd never heard before, pride mixed with grief. That crafty son of a bitch. Bobby always said the best defense was documentation. Jim, I need to ask you something. In Dad's final weeks, did you notice anything different about how he sounded on the phone? Carmen says Patricia was poisoning him slowly, but Dad managed to stay coherent enough to gather evidence. Different how? More focused, maybe. Like he was working on something important. Uncle Jim was quiet for a long moment. Now that you mention it, yeah. Bobby started asking very specific questions about family history, about your mother's medical records, about insurance policies we discussed years ago. I thought it was just him getting his affairs in order, but he was building a case. Son, your father was the most thorough man I ever knew. If Patricia Santos Martinez thought she could outsmart Bobby Mitchell, she picked the wrong target. 28 minutes later, I sat in Detective Rodriguez's unmarked car, watching Dad's house through night vision binoculars. The street looked peaceful, suburban normal, but I could see movement in what used to be my childhood bedroom, shadows passing by the windows, someone searching methodically through the space. She's been in there for at least 10 minutes, Rodriguez murmured into her radio. Suspect appears to be alone, but maintain perimeter positions. My phone buzzed with a text from the same unknown number that had been threatening me all day. Found them. Your father was cleverer than I expected. But not clever enough. I showed Rodriguez the message. She immediately radioed her team. Suspect has retrieved target items. Prepare to move on my signal. But before Rodriguez could give the order, every light in Dad's house went out simultaneously. And in the darkness, I saw the unmistakable flicker of flames beginning to spread across my childhood home. The flames spread faster than I'd ever imagined possible. Within seconds, the orange glow filled Dad's bedroom window, and I could see Patricia's silhouette moving frantically through the smoke. She's trying to burn the evidence, Rodriguez said, already calling the fire department. All units move in now. I was out of the car before Rodriguez could stop me, running across the lawn where Dad used to teach me to throw a baseball. The front door was locked, but the spare key was still hidden under the fake rock by Mom's rose bushes, the same place it had been for 20 years. The house was filling with smoke, but I could see Patricia in Dad's study, frantically feeding papers into a metal trash can that she turned into an improvised incinerator. Insurance policies, bank documents, and what looked like Dad's backup recordings were disappearing into the flames. It's over, Patricia, I called out, standing in the doorway. She spun around, her perfect hair disheveled, her designer clothes smudged with soot. But her eyes still held the calculating coldness I'd learned to fear. David. You should have taken my advice and stayed out of this. The house is surrounded. Carmen Rodriguez already told the FBI everything about Comfort Care Medical Solutions. I stepped closer, keeping my voice steady despite the smoke burning my lungs. It's over. Is it? She smiled, holding up a thick manila envelope. Your father's insurance policies, $2.3 million in coverage if his death was ruled suspicious. Clever man. But insurance policies don't pay out if the evidence burns in an accidental house fire. Through the smoke, I could hear Rodriguez's team breaking down the back door. Patricia heard it too, her eyes darting toward the kitchen. You killed my father, I said quietly. You poisoned him for over a month while pretending to care for him. I ended his suffering, she replied, her mask of sanity finally slipping completely. Your father was dying anyway, David. I just expedited the process. And he would have died grateful if you hadn't poisoned his mind against me. By telling him the truth about who you are. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The truth? The truth is that lonely old men die every day, leaving their money to ungrateful children who couldn't be bothered to visit. I provided comfort in their final months. I earned every penny. You murdered 4 people. I helped 4 suffering souls find peace while ensuring their assets went to someone who actually appreciated them. Patricia moved toward the window, the insurance policies clutched against her chest. Your father should have been grateful. Instead, he chose to spy on me, to record my private conversations, to turn you against me. The sound of footsteps in the hallway told me Rodriguez's team was close, but Patricia was already climbing onto the windowsill. Dad's study was on the ground floor. She could easily drop into the backyard and disappear into the neighborhood. Patricia, I said, playing for time. Those recordings Dad made, we already have copies. Burning his insurance policies won't change anything. She paused, one leg already through the window. Copies? Dad was an insurance man for 37 years. You think he'd keep only one set of records? I pulled out my phone, showing her the email I'd received from Henderson that afternoon. His attorney has copies of everything in 3 separate locations. The insurance policies, the recordings, even Carmen Rodriguez's employment records. Patricia's face went through a fascinating series of changes, confusion, understanding, and finally, pure rage. That's impossible. Dad figured out what you were doing in September. Everything since then has been him building an airtight case against you. I stepped closer to the window. Even dying, he was still 10 steps ahead. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something break behind her eyes. The careful calculation that had allowed her to manipulate 4 dying men, to steal $7 million, to build a murder-for-hire operation disguised as compassionate care. Patricia Santos Martinez, Rodriguez's voice came from the hallway. You're under arrest for the murders of Robert Mitchell, Thomas Martinez, Kevin Santos, and Robert Martinez. Patricia looked at the burning trash can, at the insurance policies in her hands, at the smoke filling the room that had once been my father's sanctuary. Then she smiled one last time. Your father won, she said quietly. But he's still dead. She was right. Dad was still gone, and no amount of justice would bring him back. But as Rodriguez's team led Patricia away in handcuffs, as the fire department extinguished the flames she'd set, I realized something important. Dad had spent his final months not just fighting for his life, but fighting for every other family Patricia might destroy in the future. The insurance policies were never about money, they were about ensuring that his evidence would survive even if he didn't. 6 months later, I stood in the rebuilt study of Dad's house, looking at the letter Henderson had given me after Patricia's sentencing. 25 to life, eligible for parole in 2049. Carmen Rodriguez got 12 years for her cooperation. Miguel Santos was deported after serving 18 months for conspiracy. The letter was vintage dad, methodical, thoughtful, and loving. Asterisk David, if you're reading this, it means my insurance plan worked exactly as intended. Patricia thought she was hunting a confused old man, but she was actually walking into a trap I spent 3 months setting. I'm proud of you for having the courage to finish what I started. The house is yours, son. Fill it with better memories than these final ones. Love, Dad, asterisk. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in Dad's desk drawer, next to the check for $2.3 million that the insurance company had finally released. Dad's final gift wasn't the money, it was the knowledge that sometimes, if you're patient enough and thorough enough, justice actually wins. Outside, I could hear Uncle Jim and Jake working in the garden, replanting Mom's roses that had been damaged in the fire. The Kowalskis were coming over for dinner, along with all the people Patricia had kept away from Dad's funeral. The house was going to be full of family again, exactly the way Dad had always wanted it.